What would you do if the woman you married as part of a bet became the only person who ever saw the real you and walked away when she finally learned the truth? On the top floor of the Carter Tower in downtown Chicago, where the city shimmered like glass beneath the night, Julian Carter swirled a glass of aged scotch in his hand, silent as a cathedral. At 42, Julian was everything Wall Street admired and everything the tabloids envied: a self-made billionaire, the architect of Carter Holdings, a man whose life was wrapped in steel, style, and silence. His success wasn't loud, it was absolute. But tonight, even the leather chairs and gold-rimmed crystal couldn't hide the quiet weight pressing on him. In the next room, laughter echoed: a private cocktail party with financial titans, museum board members, and a sprinkle of celebrities for good optics. Every glass was full, every smile rehearsed, every word hollow. Julian wasn't there to celebrate, he was there to win. And just as he took a sip, a familiar voice cut through the static of pleasantries. "Still the arrogant Julian, I see." Dominic Westwood, an old college friend turned sharp-edged rival, clinked his glass next to Julian's and smirked. He looked like a man who had just placed a bet he knew he'd win. Julian offered a cool smile. "Isn't that what people pay to see?" Dominic chuckled. "You've built an empire, Julian. Power, wealth, influence, but there's one thing you still don't have." Julian arched an eyebrow. "Do tell." Dominic leaned closer, lowering his voice like a man preparing to upend the table. "A real challenge, not a hostile takeover, not a billion-dollar bid. I mean someone you can't control, a person you can't buy." Julian laughed, loud enough to ripple across the string quartet in the corner. "That kind of person doesn't exist." Dominic didn't laugh. Instead, he sipped his drink and said, "Then prove it." Julian froze. Dominic continued, eyes locked on his. "I'll invest $50 million into Carter Holdings if you can marry a woman who doesn't belong in your world. Someone who's unimpressed by money. No beauty queen, no Ivy League polish. No social media fame, 6 months, no exit clause. And she can't ever know it was a bet." Silence bloomed between them like a secret nobody wanted to name. Julian's jaw tightened. He was a man who didn't lose. A man who built his empire on risk and certainty. But this wasn't a market play. This was something else. Something dangerously personal. And pride wouldn't let him walk away. "What are the terms?" he asked. Dominic smiled. "If you win, I wire the money to Carter Holdings by the 7th month. But if she walks before that, if she finds out, or worse, if you fall for her, I win. And the world will know you finally lost." Julian lifted his glass. "Deal." They clinked glasses, two men dressed in armor, made of pride. But as the sound of crystal rang out into the night, something inside Julian shifted. Just slightly, like a fracture in the glass you don't notice until it splits the whole pane. Because this time, the wager wasn't against the market. It was against his own heart. Hours later, Harper Lane, Julian's trusted executive assistant, received a private request. "Find someone different." "Not the usual type," Julian said. "I don't want elegance, no high-net-worth families. No fashion models or influencers." Harper, sharp as ever, didn't flinch. She knew Julian better than anyone. "You want someone who can't be bought?" "I want someone who doesn't want to be." She paused. "May I ask why?" Julian didn't look up from his screen. "No." She nodded. "Understood." By the end of the week, Harper returned with a list. There were a few names: social workers, teachers, nurses, but only one profile sat at the top. Maya Brooks, 35. African-American, former public school teacher, founder of a nonprofit called Transform, focused on housing and education for underserved families in Southside Chicago. No press, no photo shoots, no interest in luxury. What caught Julian's attention wasn't her resume, it was the attached video clip. Maya was speaking at a community forum. No script, no theatrics, just quiet conviction, fire behind her eyes, and a stillness that demanded the room's attention. Julian leaned back in his chair. She'll be the one. A meeting was arranged under the guise of a community investment opportunity. Julian called it a humanitarian transaction. But the moment he walked into that small wood-paneled office at Transform, something shifted. There were no art pieces, no glass walls, just children's drawings, handwritten expense notes, and a worn desk covered in reports. And Maya Brooks in a simple blouse, hair pulled back, no makeup, no pretense, stood to greet him. "Mr. Carter," she said, firm handshake steady. "Didn't think the CEO of Carter Holdings would come all the way down here to talk about broken plumbing and literacy rates." Julian gave a faint smile. Small things can lead to big change. Maya's eyes narrowed just slightly. She'd heard that line before. And she wasn't buying it. The moment Julian Carter stepped into the modest community office of Transform, he felt it. Not the usual discomfort of a room beneath his standards. Not boredom, but disorientation. It wasn't the chipped walls or the buzzing ceiling fan that threw him, it was her. Maya Brooks. She didn't flinch when he entered, didn't soften her tone, didn't try to charm him. She was calm, centered, like someone who didn't have time to impress a billionaire. That alone made her dangerous. Their meeting began with pleasantries, Julian offering words like impact, collaboration, and social responsibility. Maya listened, eyes steady, arms crossed, saying little. She finally spoke when he proposed funding her community programs, in exchange for a personal partnership. "A partnership?" she asked. Julian kept his voice cool. "A symbolic one. A marriage on paper. 6 months. You receive full backing for Transform's next 5-year plan. No strings once it ends." Maya didn't blink. She just stared, then said, "You're offering me a contract disguised as a wedding?" Julian remained still. "A mutual transaction." Maya stood, walked slowly to the window, and looked out over the small courtyard where volunteers were sorting supplies. "You're trying to buy an image," she said, still not looking at him, "and hoping I'll let you use mine." Julian opened his mouth, but she cut in. "I'm not angry," she added. "Just curious. Do you think I've never been offered anything before?" Julian hesitated. He hadn't expected that. She turned to face him again. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it'll be on my terms." Julian narrowed his eyes. "Such as? No interference with my work?" "I keep my schedule, my image, my message. Every dollar you give goes directly where I say it goes. And if I ever feel exploited, I walk. You'll notice." "No negotiation." Julian stared at her, then nodded. "Deal." Maya extended her hand again, firm and unwavering. "Then let your game begin, Mr. Carter." But as they shook hands, Julian felt something shift in his chest. A sensation he couldn't name yet, but would come to fear more than failure. Because this woman wasn't playing. 2 weeks later, their marriage was finalized. No press. No cameras, no headlines, just signatures, attorneys, and a church with a broken pipe in the back hallway. The ceremony was short, the guest list shorter. Julian wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Maya wore a simple white dress with no lace, no shimmer, no veil. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, her makeup minimal, her face unreadable. She didn't smile. He didn't reach for her hand. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, they nodded like two people sealing a merger, not starting a life. The few guests, mostly legal aides and non-profit colleagues, clapped politely. No one cheered. That night, Julian escorted Maya into the penthouse apartment atop Carter Tower. The space gleamed glass, chrome, and cold perfection. "This room is yours," he said, gesturing toward a guest suite. "Thank you," she replied. Then she shut the door. No pleasantries, no questions, no curiosity about the imported furniture or the private elevator. Julian stood alone in the hallway, glass of scotch in hand, and for the first time in years, the silence of his own home felt uncomfortable. The days that followed revealed just how much Maya refused to play the role he had quietly assigned her. She didn't lounge by the rooftop pool, didn't post curated photos on Instagram, didn't attend his charity galas or business dinners. She woke early, left before sunrise, worked 12-hour shifts at Transform, returned late, always carrying folders or groceries for the center. Julian would sometimes catch a glimpse of her reviewing grant paperwork at midnight, still in her worn sneakers and non-profit t-shirt. He had offered her a driver. She declined. He tried to introduce her to stylists, advisors, even media consultants. She ignored them all. One night, he left a diamond necklace on her desk, an emerald-cut piece that cost more than her entire center's annual budget. She found it the next morning and returned it in a box. Attached was a sticky note. "I need laptops for the after-school program, not jewelry." Julian didn't respond. He just poured another drink, but it tasted bitter. Not because he had failed to impress her, but because, for the first time, his power meant nothing. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Julian found himself watching Maya from the kitchen one morning. She was in sweatpants, hair damp from the shower, reading a report while sipping coffee from a chipped mug. There was nothing glamorous about her, but she looked grounded, real. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen someone love that simply, that fully, without needing to prove anything. And he hated how much he noticed, because the more he saw of Maya, the more his own life began to feel manufactured. Later that day, at a private dinner with investors, someone asked about his new wife. Julian paused. "She's unlike anyone I've ever met." They chuckled, but he didn't. Because it wasn't a line. It was the first honest thing he'd said all evening. They were husband and wife in name. But Julian Carter and Maya Brooks lived like distant tenants sharing an address in the sky. On paper, they were married. In practice, they were strangers. Each morning, Maya left the penthouse by 6:30 a.m. She didn't announce her departure, didn't ask if he needed anything. She simply grabbed her canvas tote, her keys, and disappeared into the city, headed for the non-profit center that Julian had funded and barely understood. Most mornings, Julian didn't see her go. He'd rise hours later, read financial briefings in silence, and take calls from investors who still assumed his new marriage was a well-manicured PR move. He let them assume, because the truth that he had married a woman who treated him like a silent partner in his own home was far harder to explain. Evenings were no better. She returned late, often after dark, her clothes smelling of cheap soap and cafeteria food. She ate leftovers in the kitchen, graded papers on the couch, and often fell asleep surrounded by budget spreadsheets and volunteer schedules. She never joined him for dinner, never commented on his tailored suits or conference calls, never asked what his day was like. At first, Julian thought it was an act, some slow play to gain leverage. But the weeks passed, and nothing changed. Maya wasn't trying to win him over or take anything from him. She was simply living her life, right beside his, but never intersecting it. One Thursday evening, Julian stood in the kitchen, watching her rinse dishes with sleeves rolled up, tired but focused. He cleared his throat. "You know the housekeeper can take care of that?" Maya didn't turn. "She already works a 10-hour shift," she said. "I can wash my own plate." He hesitated, then asked, "Is this about control?" She paused, then looked at him for the first time all day. "No," she said quietly. "It's about respect." "And dignity. Two things I don't outsource." Julian didn't respond, because there was no good answer. Later that night, he placed a box on her nightstand, small, velvet, elegant. Inside, a platinum bracelet with her initials, custom. Costly. He found it unopened the next morning. Beside it was a yellow post-it note. Hope Link needs 12 folding tables. Not diamonds. For the first time in his life, Julian felt unseen. Not ignored, unseen. Because Maya didn't care about his money, his world, his rituals of power. She saw straight through it, and she wasn't impressed. At week 4, Julian's closest advisor, Harper Lane, pulled him aside during a board meeting break. "You seem distracted," she said carefully. Julian rubbed his temples. "It's this situation." Harper arched an eyebrow. "You mean your marriage?" He nodded. "She's not playing the part." Harper folded her arms. "Maybe because she's not acting." He looked at her. "You think I made a mistake?" Harper was quiet for a beat. Then, "I think, for the first time, you picked someone who doesn't need anything from you. And that scares you." Julian laughed, but it sounded hollow. By the end of month 1, there had been no physical touch, no shared meals, no attempts at affection. Only space. Vast, heavy, and unspoken. And yet, Maya's presence lingered in the rooms she didn't occupy. Her shoes by the door, the scent of her peppermint tea, the stack of community surveys on the kitchen table. Julian found himself drawn to them, studying them, not because he had to, but because they were real. Unlike everything else in his curated, climate-controlled life. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Julian passed by the guest room and saw the door slightly ajar. Maya was asleep still in her work clothes, arms wrapped around a folder like it was a blanket. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Her brow was furrowed even in rest. She looked tired and brave. And entirely herself. He didn't say anything, just quietly closed the door. And went back to his own bed, feeling more alone than he had in years. The next morning, he sat across from her at the kitchen island. She was eating toast, reading emails. He sipped his coffee and said, "Do you regret it?" Maya didn't look up. "Regret what?" "This," he said. "The agreement, the marriage." She put down her phone and met his eyes. "I don't regret anything I chose on purpose." Julian nodded slowly. "And did you choose this?" Maya paused, then said, "I chose to protect my work. And if this marriage keeps funding thousands of meals and hundreds of beds, then yes, I chose it." There was no warmth in her voice. But no bitterness either, just truth. That night, Julian stood alone on the penthouse balcony, watching headlights snake along the freeway below. He had expected many things from this arrangement. Resistance, negotiation, maybe even seduction. What he never expected was irrelevance, and that, more than anything, was unraveling him. Because the marriage that was meant to prove his control had become a mirror he could no longer look away from. By the 6th week of their marriage, Julian Carter had become more familiar with silence than he ever imagined possible. Not the peaceful kind, the luxury silence of private jets and glass conference rooms. This silence was different. It came with footsteps that didn't pause to greet him, with dinners eaten alone, with late-night lights still on in the guest room while he tried to fall asleep in the master suite. And through it all, Maya Brooks didn't change. She didn't soften. She didn't warm. She remained exactly who she was the day he met her, centered, focused, and untouchable. Julian tried to dismiss it as strategy. Surely she was waiting for leverage, for a payoff, for control. But every time he watched her walk past him, hair tied up, coffee mug in hand, arms filled with grant applications, it hit him. She wasn't waiting on him at all. She had never tried to fit into his world. And now, for the first time, he was starting to notice hers. It began with a note on the fridge. "Out of printer ink. Can't print youth surveys." It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. But Julian saw it while grabbing bottled water before bed. The next day, without really thinking, he ordered 10 cartridges and had them delivered directly to Hope Link. That evening, Maya returned later than usual. Julian was seated at the kitchen table, scrolling through market forecasts when she dropped a folded receipt next to his hand. He looked up. "What's this?" She didn't sit. "Reimbursement for the printer ink." He blinked. "You don't have to." "I do," she said. "Because this is my work, not yours." Then she walked away. Later that night, he found himself pacing in his office, her words echoing. "This is my work, not yours." She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She was simply drawing a line. And he realized he didn't know many people who would do that. Not to him, especially not under his roof, especially not his wife. The next morning, Julian arrived at his usual breakfast spot earlier than expected. The waiter brought his coffee and paused. "Your wife was here last week," he said. "Left a great tip. Talked to the new hostess for 20 minutes about job training." Julian looked up. "She comes here. Twice a week. Orders the same thing. Doesn't like the fancy sides." Julian stared at the table, something strange tightening in his chest. That afternoon, he cancelled a board meeting and showed up at Hope Link unannounced. He told himself it was to inspect how funds were being used, to monitor ROI. But as he stepped into the converted warehouse walls lined with murals, volunteers laughing over boxes of canned goods, he felt something else. A kind of gravity, not toward the building, but toward her. Maya was in the back classroom, tutoring a girl no older than 10. They were working through a math problem. The girl was struggling. Julian stood in the doorway, unseen, watching as Maya patiently explained the equation, using pennies as counters and laughter as encouragement. When the girl finally got it, she lit up. Maya didn't cheer. Maya didn't high-five. She just smiled and said, "I knew you had it in you." Julian felt something shift inside him, and for a second, he didn't recognize the man standing in that doorway, hands in pockets, unsure if he belonged. That night, he waited until Maya came home. She looked tired. She always did. As she set her things down, he asked, "Do you like what you do?" She turned to him, surprised by the question. "I don't like it," she said. "I believe in it." He nodded slowly, then asked, "Do you think I believe in anything?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, "I think you used to believe in winning, and now, I don't know." He didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, he left another box on her desk. No jewelry, no designer tags. Just 12 new chrome folding table. It's exactly what Hope Link needed. This time there was no note in return. But when he visited the center later that week, he saw them set up in the new workshop space. No one had thanked him. And strangely, that felt right. In the weeks that followed, Julian started showing up to the center on weekends. At first, just observing, standing quietly in corners, watching the way Maya organized the flow of food distribution, how she handled short tempers and long lines with the same steady grace. But slowly, he stopped just watching. He started helping, unpacking boxes, carrying supplies, pouring coffee. People didn't recognize him at first. To them, he wasn't the billionaire on magazine covers. He was the man in the crisp shirt who didn't know how to tape donation boxes correctly, and Maya never introduced him as her husband. She didn't have to. He earned a name by showing up. One afternoon, as they cleaned up after a chaotic delivery, Maya handed him a bottle of water and sat beside him on the back step. Sweat on her brow, dust on her shoes, hair coming loose. She looked more beautiful than anyone Julian had ever known. But he said nothing, just drank his water and watched the sunset paint shadows across the alleyway. After a while, she asked, "Why are you really here?" Julian thought for a long time, then said softly, because I don't recognize myself anymore. And I'm hoping that's a good thing. Maya looked at him, not with suspicion, not with approval, but with recognition. As if for the first time she saw someone who wasn't trying to impress or manipulate her, just be there. And in that moment, Julian Carter realized the unshakable truth. She hadn't changed. He had. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Julian Carter, founder of Carter Holdings and one of Chicago's most elusive billionaires, found himself staring at a pair of muddy sneakers. They weren't his. They belonged to a 12-year-old boy who had just bumped into him in the narrow hallway of Hope Link, the non-profit center founded by Maya Brooks, the woman he now called his wife. The boy looked up, eyes wide, and mumbled, "Sorry, mister." Julian reached out instinctively to steady him. "No harm done?" The kid blinked. "Are you the milk guy?" Julian froze, then nodded, a slight smile forming. "Today, I guess I am." 2 days earlier, over dinner that wasn't really dinner, she had reheated soup. He had poured a drink. Maya had said something that changed everything. "If you want to understand me, show up, 9 a.m. Saturday. At the center, wear sneakers, leave the CEO attitude at home." And surprisingly, that he had... Now, here he was, out of place, overdressed, underprepared, and entirely unsure of why he'd said yes. The Hope Link Center wasn't glamorous. It was housed in a converted warehouse with patchy floors, hand-painted signs, and furniture that wobbled if you leaned too hard. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in warmth. There was life in the chipped paint. There was dignity in the chaos. There was Maya standing in the middle of it all like a lighthouse in a storm, giving instructions, answering questions, lifting boxes like she wasn't the one in charge. She caught Julian's eye and walked over. "Follow me." No smile. No small talk, just purpose. They entered the food pantry. Stacks of canned goods, torn boxes, a pungent smell of onions and cleaning fluid. Julian looked around. "What's my task?" Maya handed him a pair of gloves. "Sort produce?" "Good pile, bad pile. Don't mix them up. We don't waste here, but we don't poison either." Julian frowned. "How bad is bad?" "You'll figure it out." She walked off. He looked down at the mound of wilted lettuce and bruised bananas and felt lost. This was not a negotiation. This was not a press-op. This was just work, and he didn't know how to do it. He fumbled for 20 minutes, trying to keep up with a volunteer half his age who seemed to have memorized every expiration code. Then, a small voice beside him piped up, "You messed up the bins." Julian turned. It was the same boy with the muddy sneakers. "That one's for stuff we compost, not garbage." Julian looked down. He had mixed the piles. Twice. He sighed. "Thanks for the correction." The boy shrugged and went back to stacking. Julian stared after him, stunned. He wasn't used to being corrected. Especially not by a kid. The morning crawled by. Julian's back ached. His hands smelled like vinegar. His shirt was soaked through from moving crates outside. He was about to take a break when Maya appeared. "Classroom. You're on math duty." "What?" "Tutoring," she said. "One-on-one." He stared. "I haven't solved a math problem by hand in 20 years. "Well," she said, "today's your lucky day." The room was small. A whiteboard leaned against the wall. Plastic chairs lined up like a makeshift school. A girl with frizzy hair sat at one of the desks, a wrinkled worksheet in front of her. She looked up as Julian entered. "You the tutor?" "I guess I am." She pointed to a problem. "I don't get it." He sat beside her and read it. A simple, quadratic equation. He took a breath, picked up a pencil, and walked her through it. Slowly, carefully. She didn't get it at first, but he kept explaining. And then finally her eyes lit up. "I did it," she grinned. Julian smiled. Not like he had at galas. This smile was real. Earned. and it didn't come with applause, just relief. That afternoon, as the center quieted and volunteers began cleaning up, Maya handed him a plastic cup of water. She sat beside him on a bench near the loading dock. "This is my day," she said. Every day. Julian looked at her. Her face glistened with sweat. Her hair was undone. Her clothes were wrinkled. She looked exhausted, and more alive than anyone he'd met in years. "You're better than I thought," he said. Maya met his gaze. "It's not that I'm better," she replied. "It's that you've always looked wrong." The words hit him like a stone in still water. Not cruel, just honest. That night, Julian didn't go to the members-only fundraiser he'd been scheduled to attend. He sat alone on the balcony of his penthouse, still in his jeans, still smelling faintly of onions and dust. For the first time in a long time, the skyline didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel small. And that feeling wasn't unpleasant. In the days that followed, he kept showing up. Without cameras, without PR alerts, he handed out meals, carried boxes, took inventory. One morning someone asked him, "What's a guy like you doing here?" Julian just smiled. "Learning." It was supposed to be just another Tuesday. The morning air was crisp. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm. At Hope Link, the volunteers were already unloading crates of donated produce when Julian Carter arrived early, so early, in fact, that Maya paused in surprise. He didn't speak much, just nodded, pulled on his gloves, and joined the team without needing instruction. By now, they were used to his presence. He had earned their quiet acceptance, not through titles or speeches, but through sweat. But that day, something was off. Maya noticed it the moment he stepped into her office later that afternoon. Julian closed the door softly behind him, his face unreadable. She glanced up from her laptop. "You okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a thin white envelope, and placed it on her desk. She opened it slowly. Inside was the original marriage contract. The one she had signed months ago. The one with neat clauses and sterile language. The one that had never been mentioned since. Maya stared at it, then looked up. "What is this?" Julian's voice was low. "I think it's time we talk." He confessed everything. The bet, the wager with Dominic Westwood, the $50 million that hung over their entire story like a hidden snare. He didn't embellish, didn't defend. He just laid it bare piece by piece as Maya sat silently across from him. When he finished, the room felt colder. He waited for her to yell, to cry, to slam something. But she didn't. She just folded the contract carefully and set it aside. Then she looked at him, not with rage, but with something worse, disappointment. "You let me sign that paper," she said quietly, "and you let me live here, work beside you, open myself to you while knowing it was a game." Julian opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "At first, yes, but now." "No," she interrupted, "don't soften it." "You played me." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was heavy enough. He took a step toward her. "Maya, I've changed. You know I've changed." She nodded once. "I believe that. But here's what you don't understand." She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "It doesn't matter if you've changed, if the foundation was a lie." That night, she didn't come home. Julian waited on the balcony until long after midnight, the city lights below him flickering like distant truths. The guest room remained untouched, and so did the space between them. The next morning, Maya returned to the center with her usual calm, but the volunteers could feel it. The weight in her shoulders, the silence in her steps. Julian kept his distance. He didn't ask questions, he just worked. Sweeping leaves, sorting supplies, pouring coffee like it was a form of penance. 3 days passed before Maya said more than a sentence to him. It happened during the closing shift, when they were the last two left. Julian was folding chairs when Maya entered the supply room. He turned. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, "but I want to." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I don't need you to fix it, Julian. I need you to sit with it, with the damage. The part you don't get to control." He nodded slowly, and for once, he didn't reach for a solution. He just sat. In silence, in discomfort, in the truth he had created. A week later, she handed him the contract again, this time torn in half. "I kept it," she said, "not because I needed it, but because I was waiting to see if you'd ever have the courage to destroy it yourself." Julian held the torn pieces. His fingers trembled. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. Because the paper may have burned in his hands, but it was his ego that finally shattered. Julian Carter didn't return to the penthouse. Not that night, not the next, not for weeks. Instead, he stayed in the back office at Hope Link, sleeping on an old cot beside stacks of inventory sheets and donated winter coats. There was no staff meeting, no formal arrangement. He simply stayed the same way he had started, showing up at the center in the beginning. Quietly, without announcement, only now. It wasn't out of curiosity. It was out of necessity. Because for the first time in his life, Julian didn't want to run from failure. He wanted to sit inside it. Let it sting, let it teach. Each morning, he rose before the sun and swept the sidewalks. He scrubbed the kitchen tiles, replaced broken shelves in the storage unit, hauled crates from delivery vans. Not once did he mention who he was. Not once did he bring up Maya. Not once did he explain anything. Because this part of his story wasn't about explanation, it was about showing up again and again, until people stopped looking at him like the man who lied, and started seeing the man who stayed. The volunteers noticed first. No PR team, no articles. Just Julian in faded jeans, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing marker stains off cafeteria tables. One of the teens asked him, "Aren't you like that billionaire from TV?" Julian paused, then nodded. "I used to be." The kid grinned and handed him a crayon drawing. "You look better here." Back at the penthouse, the staff wondered when he'd return. He didn't. He stopped answering calls, cancelled public appearances, turned down invitations to boardroom galas and financial summits. For the outside world, Julian Carter had gone off-grid. For the people at Hope Link, he'd finally arrived. A few weeks later, Maya received a report from one of her team leads. Julian helped redesign the adult literacy space. He had painted the walls, installed new bookshelves, built desks by hand. When she looked at the photo attached, Julian covered in paint, laughing with a volunteer named Eleanor, it hit her in the chest. He wasn't performing. He wasn't angling for her attention. He was just working. That weekend, the center held a vocational fair for families in transition. Julian stood at the registration table, handing out clipboards with a smile, calling people by name, remembering which parents needed jobs and which teens needed laptops. Maya watched from the second-floor landing. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching this man she once believed was incapable of understanding anyone without a stock portfolio. He hadn't tried to win her back, hadn't written a speech, hadn't made a single promise. He just kept showing up. And somehow, that was more powerful than any apology. Late one evening, after the center had closed and the last of the volunteers had gone home, Julian sat alone in the multi-purpose room, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The room still smelled of bleach and cardboard boxes. He stared out the window. No penthouse skyline, no noise, just the hum of the street lamp and the sound of wind pressing against the window pane. He didn't miss the view. He didn't miss the silence of his luxury apartment. He missed nothing. Because here in this worn-down space, he felt real. That night, Maya walked in quietly. She didn't speak at first. She just sat across from him. For a while, they said nothing. Then Julian broke the silence.
I never meant to hurt you. Maya looked at him. I know, he continued, but I did. And I'll never ask you to forget that, or fix it. I'm not here to be redeemed by you. She nodded slowly. Then why are you still here? Julian took a long breath. Because the man who made that bet doesn't deserve to walk away clean. And the man I want to become has to earn his way from the ground up. There was silence again. But it wasn't heavy this time. It felt like space, something being made between them, not broken. The next morning, Julian helped distribute blankets in a rainstorm. His expensive leather shoes were soaked, his coat stained with mud. His hair clung to his forehead as he handed out bundles to people in plastic ponchos and torn gloves. No cameras, no press, just soaked hands. Quiet thank yous. Nods from strangers who didn't care about his past, but saw something different in his eyes. That evening, an elderly man asked him, "You're that Carter guy, right?" "The money man," Julian smiled. "Not anymore. Today, I hand out warmth." Back in the storage room that night, Maya found Julian fixing a broken shelf. She didn't interrupt, she just leaned in the doorway. He looked up. They locked eyes. There were no declarations, no sweeping confessions, no final page in a romantic script. There was just him, hammer in hand. Sleeves rolled, doing the work, and Maya, for the first time, didn't feel like she had to carry the weight alone. She took a step inside and picked up a second hammer. The sky over Chicago was steel gray the morning Clarence Brooks walked through the doors of Hope Link. He wore a dark wool coat, a perfectly knotted tie, and an expression carved from years of conviction. Every step he took into the center echoed like a disruption. The volunteers froze. Even the air seemed to still. Because Clarence Brooks, former director of one of the most exclusive philanthropic foundations in the country, had publicly dismissed Maya Brooks 3 years earlier, calling her unqualified, too emotional, and unsuitable for leadership in serious humanitarian work. Now, he stood in her lobby, holding a folder, and standing beside him, visibly nervous, was his daughter, Maya. They entered a small conference room. Inside, Julian Carter was already seated. He didn't rise right away. Clarence nodded toward him stiffly, then took the seat across from him. There was no handshake, no small talk, just tension. Julian finally said, "Didn't expect to see you here." Clarence cleared his throat. "I didn't come for pleasantries. I came to face the truth." He looked at Maya, then opened the folder and slid it across the table. A signed pledge. $3 million, personally donated, unrestricted use for the next phase of Hope Link's expansion. Julian blinked. Maya didn't touch the folder. Clarence took a breath. "I didn't come to apologize," he said. "Apologies are too easy. I came to admit I was wrong. Wrong about this center. Wrong about you. Wrong to think I knew what service looked like just because I'd sat on boards." Maya folded her arms. "And what changed your mind?" Clarence looked at Julian, then back at her. "Him." The room went still. Clarence continued, voice low. "I watched him, the way he showed up, quiet. No cameras, no nameplate, the way he stopped trying to lead with his money and started following your example." He paused. "That told me you weren't just idealistic. You were right. About all of it." Maya's face didn't soften. Not yet. But something in her eyes shifted just a little. Julian stayed quiet. Because this wasn't his scene. This was a reckoning long overdue. Later that evening, the three of them sat on the steps outside the center, the last streaks of sunset fading behind the buildings. Clarence looked tired, not just in body, but in belief. He turned to Maya. "You have your mother's spine," he said, "and her fire." Maya nodded slowly. I know. There was a silence that felt like peace trying to find a foothold. Then Clarence stood, nodded at Julian, and left. As the footsteps disappeared, Julian turned to Maya. You should have told me he was your father. She exhaled sharply through her nose. Just like you should have told me I was part of a bet. Julian winced. Fair. They sat in silence again. Then he said, Do you believe him? Maya shook her head. I believe in what he gave me. Julian leaned back. And me? Maya looked at him. Long, quiet, unblinking. I believe in what you build when no one's watching. The next week was different. Not loud, not dramatic, but different. The volunteers smiled more. The kids lingered longer. Hope Link felt like a place finally recognized, not just by donors, but by legacy. Julian worked harder than ever. He helped set up a computer lab, repaired leaks, and stayed late to grade adult literacy tests. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't seek forgiveness. He just kept building. One night, as they were locking up, Maya handed him an old notebook, her original Hope Link journal worn, weather-stained, edges curled. I started this the week the center opened, she said. Last page was always blank. He opened it. Blank. Unwritten. She looked at him, because I was saving it for something I thought was impossible. Julian's throat tightened. He pulled out a pen and wrote, This is the first day of something real. Built on truth, led by love, guided by you. He handed it back to her. Maya read the words, then closed the journal. She didn't smile. But she didn't walk away either. That night, Julian didn't go home. He stayed. And for the first time in weeks, Maya didn't send him to the guest cot. She brewed them tea. They sat in the break room, knees almost touching, watching the city through the small, fogged-up window. They said little, but they shared something much louder. Trust, rebuilding itself, one breath at a time. It was never meant to be a real marriage. Not in the way most people imagined it, with vows spoken in love, a shared home built in trust, or a slow blending of lives over years. Julian Carter and Maya Brooks had agreed to terms, not dreams. What began as a wager had grown into something weightier. But still, neither had dared to name it. Until now. A month had passed since Clarence Brooks walked into Hope Link and left behind both a donation and a reckoning. Julian hadn't returned to the penthouse. He no longer wore cufflinks. He no longer arrived in black cars. He came in on foot, same jeans, same sleeves rolled, same hands covered in paint, plaster, and ink. But something else had changed. It was in the way he looked at Maya now. Not like a man observing something rare, but like a man choosing to stay beside it. They had stopped talking about the past, not because it didn't matter, but because they had already sat with it, felt every ache, held every silence. And now it lived behind them, like a scar. Visible, but no longer bleeding. One Saturday morning, Maya found Julian fixing a leaky faucet in the women's restroom. She leaned against the doorframe. Need help? He looked over his shoulder, smiling. Only if you know where I left the wrench. She walked in, picked up the tool, and crouched beside him. You ever thought of doing this for a living? He chuckled. Strangely, it's more satisfying than managing portfolios. There was a pause. Then Maya said softly, You're not pretending anymore. Julian turned to her, his voice low. I think this is the first time in my life I'm not performing for anyone. That night, after the center closed, they stayed late. Just the two of them. Maya lit candles in the old break room, the flickering flames casting soft shadows across the walls. She brought 2 cups of tea. Julian brought nothing, just his tired body and a heart that no longer needed to prove anything. They sat close.
Not touching.
Not yet, but closer than they'd ever been. You know, Maya said, when you first walked into my office, I knew you were dangerous. Julian tilted his head. Because of the money? No, she said. Because you didn't know what it meant to need someone without using them. He nodded slowly. I didn't.
But I do now. She looked at him, steady, grounded.
Why did you stay?
Julian thought for a long time, then said, because I wanted to learn how to be the kind of man who deserved to stand beside you even if you never looked back. Maya's eyes didn't waver, and then quietly she reached across the small table and laid her hand on his. Not as a gesture of romance, but as a declaration. I see you. I believe you, I choose you. They didn't call it love. They didn't say anything grand. But in the days that followed, something shifted. They ate breakfast together, just toast and fruit and quiet conversation. They walked home from the center side by side. Julian would pause to speak to residents on the sidewalk. Maya would introduce him to new interns like he wasn't a billionaire but just someone who showed up. And that's what he became, a man who showed up. When HopeLink celebrated its 5th anniversary, the staff begged Maya to speak. She agreed, but only if Julian spoke first. He stood at the small podium in the multi-purpose room, wearing a button-down shirt he'd washed himself, hair still damp from a day of work.
No speech, he said. Just this. He turned to Maya. I walked into this center because I thought I could control something. Maybe even someone. He paused. But what I found was a woman who couldn't be bought, couldn't be moved, and never once asked to be impressed. He looked down for a second, then back up. She didn't just change the way I live. She changed the way I see the world. Then he stepped aside. No applause. Just stillness. And when Maya stepped forward, she didn't begin with thanks or titles. She simply said, we all want to be seen. But sometimes it takes someone putting everything down to truly look. Later that evening, as the guests cleared out and folding chairs were stacked away, Maya and Julian remained on the stage alone. The lights had dimmed. The room was quiet again. Julian sat on the edge of the platform. Maya stood beside him. She looked at him for a long time, then said, what if I'd said no? He smiled. Then I'd probably still be pretending to run the world. She sat down beside him. And what if you hadn't accepted that bet? He looked up at the ceiling, thoughtful. Then I wouldn't have lost you. He turned to her. But I also would have never had the chance to truly find myself. She didn't smile, but she leaned in, rested her head gently on his shoulder, not out of obligation, not for image, but because she wanted to. And in that quiet moment, beneath low lights and peeling paint, two people who once entered each other's lives with lies and power finally sat together as equals. No contract, no wager, no script, just love. Without pretending. On a crisp autumn morning, with leaves rustling across cracked sidewalks and steam rising from early coffee cups, Julian Carter stepped into a quiet community garden in Southside Chicago. He wore no suit, no watch, no shadow of the man he once was, just worn jeans, a soft sweater, and the weight of lessons earned not bought. In his hands, he carried a wooden plaque. Simple, hand-carved. It read, Hope built here. He set it into place just outside the new training center, a space that once was an abandoned factory and now hummed with life. Adults learning job skills, children learning literacy, people rediscovering worth. This wasn't a ribbon cutting, no press. No speeches, just the work, and Julian was at peace with that. Inside, Maya Brooks stood at the front of the classroom, coaching a group of teenagers through mock interviews. Her voice, clear and steady, rang with confidence, not learned from privilege,
but forged in resilience. Julian watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets. When the session ended, the students filtered out with nervous laughter and wrinkled resumes. Maya turned and saw him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. She walked over and smiled, not as reward, not as invitation, but as something quiet and lasting, belonging. Later that afternoon, they sat together on a bench beneath a mural the neighborhood kids had painted. It showed a pair of hands, one dark, one light planting seeds into the ground. Maya traced the brushstrokes with her fingers. "You ever think," she asked, "about what your name used to mean?" Julian looked out across the street. "Every day," he said. "Used to mean power, control." "Deals." He glanced at her. "Now, I hope it means something quieter." Maya leaned into him slightly. "It already does." In the weeks that followed, Julian finalized the dissolution of the Carter Foundation. He created a new model. No logos, no lavish galas, no billionaires on brochures. He called it the Vance Hope Initiative, in honor of the neighborhood that changed him. It wasn't a charity, it was a network. Community-run, grassroots-led, focused on dignity, not dependency. Julian refused the title of director. He signed documents as infrastructure advisor. Maya helped write the mission statement. It began, "No one gets left behind." He didn't go back to the penthouse. He sold it. He moved into a renovated walk-up not far from Hope Link, in a unit above the new nutrition co-op Maya had helped design. People in the neighborhood sometimes still whispered, "Is that really him?" But the whispers faded over time. Because Julian didn't need to be recognized anymore. He just needed to be useful. On the anniversary of the first day, he'd stepped into Hope Link as the milk guy. The staff held a small dinner. No tuxedos, just crockpots and mismatched chairs and laughter that filled the room better than any chandelier. After dessert, Eleanor Chase, the eldest volunteer, raised her glass. "I once thought rich people only showed up for photo ops," she said, "but this man showed up with a mop and stayed until closing." The room laughed. Julian blushed. Maya squeezed his hand under the table, and in that squeeze was everything they didn't need to say out loud. One night, as they walked home through quiet streets, Maya stopped beneath a lamppost. She turned to him. "Do you ever miss it? The power? The safety?" Julian looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible over the city glow. "Some days, I miss how easy it was to hide behind it." Then he looked at her. "But I never missed the man I was." She nodded and took his hand. Not for show. Not to steady him, but to remind him this is who you are now. Months passed. They kept building, not just Hope Link, but trust. Community, new lives. People stopped calling it a project. They started calling it a movement. And at the center of it, always, were Julian and Mayano as leaders, perched above, but as partners, walking with. On the first day of spring, Maya handed Julian a letter. Inside, a copy of the original marriage contract rewritten, no terms, no expiration, no payout clause, just 2 signatures, a date, and a note at the bottom in Maya's handwriting. "This time I choose you, not for funding, not for reputation, but for the life we built, one brick, one meal, one truth at a time." Julian stood there, letter trembling in his hands. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't hide them. He just stepped forward and held her. They didn't renew vows in front of crowds. They didn't host a second ceremony. But every morning after that day, when Julian rolled up his sleeves and picked up a broom, and Maya poured coffee for volunteers and sat down to answer phone calls from people asking for help, they lived their vows, without pretending, without power, without contracts, just presence and purpose. And that, more than any title he'd ever held, became the legacy Julian Carter chose for himself. Not to be remembered for what he had, but for what he gave. Not for how loud he was, but for how faithfully he stayed. In a world where wealth is often mistaken for worth, the story of Julian Carter reminds us that true character isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we're willing to unlearn. Once a man driven by power, Julian entered a marriage built on a wager,
but it was in losing control that he finally gained clarity. Through his journey with Maya, we witness a quiet, transformative truth. Redemption is not a moment, it's a decision we recommit to every single day. For older Americans, many of whom know what it means to carry regret, to seek meaning beyond success, this story offers something deeper than entertainment. It offers hope. Hope that it's never too late to change. That legacy isn't sealed by past mistakes, but shaped by present action. That choosing humility, service, and truth no matter when is always a path worth walking. We may not all be billionaires, but we all have a chance to rebuild, to reconcile, and to become the kind of person we'd be proud to sit beside in silence.
And sometimes that's all it takes to change a life, starting with our own.